Good morning. I have to admit, there was a part of me that just wanted to kind of hold the flower up and sit here. But here we go. So I would first like to start with just a lot of gratitude to sit with this theme of interbeing, suffering, and liberation over the last month or two, and to talk about like personal reflections on it. And I'm just really grateful for that opportunity. And so I'll start with an introduction of some personal reflections, and then the poet in me and the writer in me has a few stories to share and a couple historical documents as well on an elder in our tradition that I feel really defines this theme of interbeing, of suffering and liberation. And then we'll come full circle to concrete, like what do we do with this in our practice? So that's kind of where we probably will go a bit today, this morning. So the first thing that came to mind for me when I heard this theme was no mud, no lotus. Thai's calligraphy, that Gatha. And I almost took this out of the talk because John mentioned it in the first week. But then I thought, if we're both mentioning this, maybe there's something to this Gatha, and it could really be helpful to us as we're practicing with this theme over the next couple of days. I know it's very helpful to me just in my life. So it's about, using mud to make beauty in your life. And that just seems like a very precious thing, especially in the next couple of days as we're making that switch to transformation. So there was that. And then I want to start by sharing a little bit of my personal story, my personal suffering. And the reason why I do this is because I find that when I do this, almost always there are people that are listening who are in the exact same situation I am. And so I use it as a resource for myself, for others, so that I can find these people in Sangha and they can be a resource to me. So little Lotus me grew up in like 4 generations of a lot of mud comprising of addiction and also mental illness. And one of my primary caregivers was diagnosed as schizophrenic, major depression. And I put that in quotes because to me, those labels, it's a lot deeper than that, and often they're just not very helpful. But that was the labels that we had at that time. And so mental illness and addiction was passed down to descendants, my descendants. And as a result, there's been incarceration, there's been illegal activity, there's been unstable housing, family daily existence for 4 generations of many men in our family, lots of grandpas and papas and great grandpas that were suffering with a lot of this mud, and a lot of women, myself included, who were kind of martyrs in this whole dynamic. And that's my root suffering, really, is that aspect of it. But as a result of all of this, it directly fueled my yearning for freedom. I know that. I can see that in my life. And as a result, I found Thai and found Sangha and discovered that I could take this salt, this cup full of a lot of heavy salt, and pour it into this lake of Sangha. And I really started to not suffer as much, not nearly as much. And I went through a lot of transformation over the years that I've been part of this practice. And that'll be the last part of this talk, okay, the yumminess of this talk. And so one of the beneficial parts of my own practice personally, especially with this theme, is studying the Zen ancestors. I just love doing that. And I love connecting with those that have come before me, because I know they did this before me. They know how to do this. And I think connecting to that can really be a source of strength in my own practice. So there's an elder in our tradition, Maha Pajapati. You might have heard of her. And she was the aunt of the Buddha. And 5 days after he was born, she became the mother of the Buddha. So this elder is, I feel, someone that we can look at her life, and as I tell the story of her, see yourself in her story, see parts of her story and how you connect to them. So the first record we have of her was at her sister's death. So Maya, her sister, Mama of the Buddha, is in childbirth, and she gave birth to this baby, and 7 days later, she's fully aware she's going to die, fully aware. And she passes the baby on to Pajapati. So put yourself in those shoes, unsolicited child, and suddenly your sister's dying, and boom, here you go, right? So as we think about this, I'd like to read what is a Cambodian written record, or actually, I'm sorry, a Cambodian spoken record of this story. So I want to read this. So, little Sister Gotami, hold to these words of guidance I ask you now to receive. Forgive me, since giving birth to my son, only 7 days have passed, and my life withers to nothing as I pass on to the next world. Now, as for me, dear sister, don't worry, for death is sure. No more can I hold my son, the refuge of gods and men. You who pity your sister, you lovely girl, that is why I ask you to hug, to hold this motherless child of mine, to nurse him, to bathe his body, attend to him day and night, care for him like no other. Oh, my golden girl, don't stop. So here is Pajapati. She has this new baby. And imagine yourself in her situation. Your grief heart could have pushed this child away. Your resentful heart might have just completely walked away from it. I mean, after all, the death of your sister was the result of this baby. But by all accounts, she did not do this. She took this child, she bonded with this child. They had a very close relationship, supposedly. She raised this child as one of her own. And if she had walked away from this, imagine maybe the seed of Buddhism would not have even sprouted. We might not be sitting here together today. So I see a real interweaving of her decision with suffering and us being here practicing today, that interbeing nature of it. So I think I see wisdom, and it's a gift in this first action that we have of her on historical record. She did not turn away from her suffering. She went right into the heart of it, like John said yesterday. She went right into the heart of her suffering. And she realized that in order to transform, I have to see this suffering. I have to see it. And she did that. And I think too of Michael, who shared through Bernie, his teacher. It became a key ingredient to her life, right? This child. And she raised this child. So then what happens is, we probably know the story, but if we don't, right about 29 years old-ish, her second suffering pops up, right? And Buddha goes outside the palace gates and he sees old age, sickness, and death. And he comes back and he says, I gotta go. I gotta find freedom, right? And he leaves the household. So this is her second suffering. I mean, imagine this, right? We know what happened to the Buddha, but she didn't know what happened to the Buddha. So suddenly he goes from, having warm meals to being hungry, to having a sumptuous palace to being homeless, being safe to being in the wilds. And in those days they had tigers and boa constrictors and all kinds of things, right? And he's homeless. He's basically leading a life of homelessness. And in the ultimate dimension, we know what happened to Buddha, but in the historic dimension, he left the palace, he left his kingship, he left his wife, he left his child, he abandoned his mother. I'm sure it felt that way. So I really see this as her second suffering. So what did she do? the records, the historical records say she wept and she wailed and she cried so many tears that she went blind, they say. This is her third suffering. She goes blind. And when I saw this, I started reading the commentary. I was like, what's up with the blindness? What's up with that? And apparently it's kind of like, we say we die of a broken heart. In the day when she was alive, they would say that you would cry yourself blind, that you had so much sorrow that you would cry yourself blind. Was she actually blind or not? We don't know. But I imagine this was probably a lot of mud, right? Her mud. She enters into mud. So by all accounts, like 6 to 12-ish years go by. 6 to 12-ish years, right? She's in this veil of darkness. And I could see this as interbeing with the Buddha, because I believe he was probably also in a veil of darkness as he searched and he yearned for freedom and he looked, right, to find this. So they were very much intertwined. And one day he returns. And by all accounts, he's enlightened. And it's really obvious because he has water pouring from his body. I don't know. This is just what it says. And someone took some of that water and they applied it to Pajapati's eyes. And it is said that the veil of darkness was lifted and she saw the light of the Dharma. So she could see. And so here's this enlightened son, and Pajapati sees the light of the Dharma. So again, this interbeing nature of the two of them. And so we have a lotus, finally. Her blindness goes away. Here's this long-lost son, and he's home, and he's enlightened. We've got some lotuses that are coming out of this. So Buddha stays very nearby, supposedly. He's in a grove, and he's teaching, and the men all go out to hear the Dharma, and they come back into the ladies, and they're telling, wow, this guy, he's really got it together. Like, I think he's the real deal. And they're telling stories. They're telling stories. And the ladies start to want to hear the stories too. So they go to Pajapati, and she becomes their voice. And they say to her, won't you go talk to your son and ask him if we can come hear these stories? We want to hear these stories. So she does this. She goes to him. And Buddha actually receives the ladies and says, yes. And the fourfold Sangha starts to come into existence, but there's really only 3 petals that have opened, right? So the men have come. Now the lay women are allowed in to listen to the Dharma, and the men are becoming monastics and monks. Okay. So she goes back home, and the ladies and her and everybody else, there's about 6 years of him teaching close by, and they deepen their practice, and they study, and they study, and they study. So I have to go back a bit because I have a habit of once I get started, I don't look at my notes. And I missed a really important part. And the important part was when Buddha came home, so go back 6 to 12 years, he was enlightened, she was now seeing, et cetera, et cetera. And Mahapajapati invited him to the women's quarters. Nobody quite knew the extent, but they knew he had changed. Okay, so we've gone back in time here. And she invited him to the women's quarters. And it said that there were over 500 women in these quarters. And this is like taboo. You don't do this. You don't mix men with women in that day. But Buddha got his disciples and he came to the women's quarters and he spoke. And she did a dinner party, it is said. And they ate dinner together. And he started to speak, and he started really small on like householder duties, blah, blah, blah. And it said he's given a graduated discourse to the Four Noble Truths. So he mentioned to the women the Four Noble Truths. And it is said that Mahapajapati said, I understand this, this is clear. And records mention she enters stream entry at that point. And stream entry is, you're going to arrive. The current now has you. You've stepped into the boat. Nothing is going to keep you from enlightenment. And she was able to see this very clearly. So you can see how this yearning would have developed and developed and developed in her. She got this. She was very interwoven, interbe with her son. So now we go ahead and, women are allowed in to listen to the Dharma as lay people. And they go back home and they study. And Buddha leaves. He goes off. And they're not sure he's going to come back. And the 500 women and her start to get an idea in their head. And you may know where this is going. And they decide they're going to show up and they want to become monastics. They want to become nuns. And at this point, I want to read you the story because I find it really humorous how she decides she's going to do this. Okay? So I'll read you the story. Now, at one time, the Buddha was staying in the Banyan monastery, and Maha Pajapati Gotami went to the palace where the Buddha was, approached and greeted him, and standing at a respectful distance, she spoke to him. It would be good if women could be allowed to renounce their homes and enter into a homeless state under the Dharma and the discipline of the Tathagata, another name for Buddha. He says, enough, Gotami. Don't set your heart on women being allowed to do this. A second and a third time, Mahapajapati made the same request in the same words and received the same reply. And thinking that the Blessed One would not allow women to enter into homelessness, she bowed to him and departed in tears. Then the Blessed One set out for Vasali, and Mahapajapati cut off her hair, put on saffron-colored robes, and headed for Vasali with over 500 women. She arrived at the great grove with swollen feet, covered in dust. Weeping, she stood there outside the hall. Now remember, weeping made her blind before. So she's in this great mud. So seeing her standing there, the Venerable Ananda, who was the Buddha's attendant, asked, "Why are you crying?" Because, Ananda, the Blessed One does not permit women to renounce their homes and enter into homeless state under the Dharma and discipline proclaimed by the Tathagata. Okay, so what happens? So Ananda, he intervenes. He sees this great sorrow and he sees this mud and he goes to the Buddha and he says to the Buddha, "Didn't you say that women can reach a state of freedom? In other words, can't everyone be free? I mean, this is what you say." And Buddha said, "Yes, Ananda." And he asked, "Didn't she raise you at her breast and give you life? In other words, aren't you like inextricably connected?" And he says, "Yes, Ananda." And Buddha folds. He says, "Yes." Women can come in and the fourfold Sangha is born, right? So my translation of this, I'm a translator, so I do a lot of translating just kind of naturally, is hasn't she been in the mud with you? Yeah. Isn't she growing lotuses? I mean, and also, can she really go back? I mean, her head's shaved, she's put on robes, the sandals are gone. I mean, what are you going to do, right? So this brings Pajapati's second wisdom. And this, to me, I think is her greatest lesson for me personally, is she did set her heart on freedom. She set her heart on freedom. All conditions around her said this was not going to happen, and she set her heart on freedom. And she did a lot of actions to make sure that that freedom was hers, right? And I think setting our hearts on freedom can orient our lives. And she knew that. She knew that, and that's what she did. So this is kind of my greatest takeaway from Maha Pajapati. And Maha is the great. So she was in her own right very, very honored. And Pajapati being the protector of children. So she was the great protector of children. She called them to their best. That's how I kind of look at that. And I think she showed us that just as suffering must be seen to transform it, so too must liberation be seen in order to arrive at it. We have to see liberation in order to arrive there. And from my family lesson is if I'm stuck in suffering, I am a martyr. I've learned to identify that. And if I use suffering to propel myself forward to freedom, then I'm a Buddha. That's what I've discovered. And Buddhas are people that take mud and they make lotuses out of it, right? And we have done that in our own lives. I know that. So each moment of suffering is a liberating element. That's the way I've looked at it over the last couple months, is every single bit of suffering is a liberating element. It has potential to be that. So to recap, okay, Pajapati's suffering. She had the death of her sister and this new baby. She had abandonment of the child that she raised. And then she had blindness. And her gift and her wisdom was go into the heart of that suffering and set your heart on liberation. Go into that heart of suffering and really set your heart also on liberation. So how do we do this? You know, I thought of a couple ways concretely for myself. We'll kind of shift gears here. And Ty's 7th mindfulness training is like, that was the light bulb moment for me in my practice, to live happily in the present moment. And he also translates, I don't know if any of y'all saw this in the latest issue of the Mindfulness Bell, but he also translates the Sanskrit phrase, and it's live happily in the present moment, Drishta Dharma Sukha Viharan. He translates this as dwelling happily in things as they are. Dwelling happily in things as they are. We may not like it, right? But that's the practice, dwelling happily in things as they are. So 2 concrete ways for me to have stepped onto the liberating path when it comes especially to my background was to spend time every day in freedom, every single day. And then when I had that down for a little while, I would spend my moments, as many moments as I could manage in freedom. And I'll give you some examples. These are latest examples from just since leaving for retreat. Okay, so flew from Reno to is it the SeaTac? Is that the airport? Okay, and as we were landing, there was a lot of turbulence. And I don't like to fly very much, so I could feel this in myself. And across the aisle from me were these 2 little ones. They were maybe like 2 and 3 or 4 years old or whatever. And I looked over at them and I'm like, oh boy, there's gonna be some wailing going on, right? I look over there and the little ones, they look scared, like their expressions have changed. And what their mama does is every time the plane goes up, she goes, woo! And every time the plane goes down, she goes, ah! Woo! Ah! And I looked around and people are smiling, you know, I'm smiling. And the babies, if it's not turbulent, they're doing this, like bouncing around, right? So she completely took that moment and she turned it into a moment of freedom, not just for herself and her babies, but again, that interbeing for all of us on the plane, right? She did that. So she took a moment of fear and she really liberated it into joy. I mean, that was just so skillful, I thought. And then another example is I went to lunch with Jonathan and Mike, and you know, we're sitting and we're catching up, and Jonathan asked about my loved one, my descendant, who's really suffering of late for a decent amount of time. And I kind of started getting into my woe a little bit. I could start to identify it. And suddenly this little girl goes skipping past our table and she has her pigtails and she's singing. And these 2 look over just like they are now, and they have the most beautiful smile. And it was like, it woke me up. And I went, oh yes, okay. There's more to life, right? Here's this liberating element right here. And just turn that into a moment of freedom. And I woke up from that. And so that is it, really spending time in liberation and freedom. And then my second way is connection. That is a huge one for me. Spend time connecting. Do we connect to our ancestors, to our Zen ones who came before us? Do we connect to Sangha? What are the things that do connect us? Does singing connect us? Does drawing and art connect us? What's connecting to us? And so really spending time connecting, because I really believe wholeheartedly liberation is not a solo activity. It is just not. It happens in community and it happens in relationships. So when we're suffering, we tend to want to isolate, but actually one of the antidotes I really believe is connection to that. I also see our practice as being a connection. The Zendo is like a docking station. We can come in and just plug in. And Thai has mentioned that loneliness is truly the ill-being of our time. So this connection is really part of that as well. And I wholeheartedly believe that. There was a recent study that I read a couple months ago, and the question was, does this describe you? You're no longer close to anyone. And 39% of Americans said yes. I mean, really, connection is very important for liberation to happen. So I want to get into a few lotuses and some transformation, okay? And my suffering really transformed for me when I realized, as John said yesterday in his Dharma talk, the us of my suffering. That was a huge transformational moment. And I started working at a treatment center for those that are struggling with addiction. And I'm there 1 day a week, and I work with the staff and I work with the residents there together. We practice together, and this practice. And it's been hugely liberating to me because my loved one may not be doing so well, but here are some ones that are just amazing. And this treatment center is holistic, mindfulness-based approach. So it's such a good fit for me. And then there's lots of loved ones, and I've met a few here on retreat that are struggling supporting a person who's maybe in addiction, mental illness, active addiction. And so I thought, well, gosh, if there's all these people out there, let's do a Sangha. So Lotuses in the Mud is the name of that Sangha, and we meet online, and it's been beautiful. We've been going for 3 years. And we now have a network that is available with curriculum management software, and it's 24/7. Anybody can show up on that software and get support. And that just went out the beginning of September. And we are doing our first class, which y'all might appreciate, which is coming up, is Am I a Martyr or a Bodhisattva, is what we're calling it, because we talk about the Bodhisattvas a lot. So that's the class, Am I a Martyr or a Bodhisattva? And we have folks that are going to show up, and we're going to discuss this and look at it in our lives. So these are really the lotuses that have come out of my suffering. Radiant Light Zen is a lotus that has come out of my suffering. I was really looking to put into more action my awakening. And this has been huge. Radiant Light Zen has been huge to live this every day of the week. And the last one that I'll mention that's a real lotus that's been a sweet surprise is I'm a sign language interpreter. That's what I do as by profession. And I've had a young one in my life that I've known since they were in elementary school and now in their 20s that goes through active psychosis. And I've interpreted for this one all these years. And she's now part of Clubhouse. And she goes 4 days a week. And she's in this program for people that experience active psychosis. And they're together. And we do pickleball. And we go grocery shopping. And we do all kinds of stuff. We do yoga, we cook, we garden, we do all this stuff. So I've really been able to see it's a beautiful group of just lotuses, lotuses, lotuses popping up, popping up. And it's been quite lovely. So to kind of cap it up, our suffering impacts everybody around us. We know this. Our freedom, too, affects all those around us. And Maha Prajapati's suffering and freedom impacted all those around her, including the Buddha. And the Buddha's suffering and freedom impacted all those around him. And Their suffering and liberation has impacted us in this moment. And that's the interbeing, interconnection, amazing part of our practice. So we are, we are inextricably bound. There's no separation. There's no separation whatsoever. So I would like to offer gratitude, to Maha Pajapati, the great protector of children. And she taught us, do not abandon our suffering, do not refuse it, embrace it, tend it. Sounds a lot like Thai, huh? Picking up the baby, right? Taking care. In her situation, she had a literal baby, but we can also, again, the writer in me looks at that metaphor, doesn't escape me, that, she picked up this child, she bonded with this child, she saw the Buddha in this child. And we all have children that are knocking on our door, our heart all the time, internally too, that want to be seen, they want to be held. They are probably a seed of liberation for us. So this is an amazing lesson to me. And then set our heart on liberation. My golden child, don't stop. That line is so beautiful. My golden child, don't stop. Set our hearts on liberation. And when we do this, the lotuses pop up. It will happen, right? We're in the current. There's nothing that can derail us at this point. So to close, I'd like to read Maha Pajapati's poem. And these are supposedly her own words. And it's a book that's called The First Free Women. I don't know, it's a big Sangha book. We like this one in Radiant Light, and we like this one in Morning Light. And I'd like to close with her poem in her words. So just put yourself in a comfortable position. I see most of you are already doing this. It's so wonderful. And a warm, receptive heart to receive this. Maha Pajapati, protector of children. I know you all. I have been your mother, your son, your father, your daughter. You see me now in my final role, kindly grandmother. It's a fine part to go out on. You might have heard how it all began when my sister died and I took her newborn son to raise as my own. People still ask, did you know then what he would become? What can I say? What mother doesn't see a Buddha in her child? He was such a quiet boy. The first time he reached for me, the first time I held him while he slept, how could I not know? To care for all children without exception, as though each will someday be the one to show us all the way home. This is the path. To care for all children without exception, as though each will someday be the one to show us all the way home. This is the path.